Welcome to Legal Resources Radio, where we invite you into the world of social justice, advocacy, and public interest law. Throughout this podcast series, we'll share stories, insights, and expert advice from our dedicated team at the Legal Resources Center, as well as from our valued guests. In each episode, we'll dive into the legal landscape, tackle pressing social issues, and aim to empower you with the knowledge to make a difference. Whether you're a community activist, a legal professional, passionate about social justice, or just curious, this is the place for you. So wherever you are, washing dishes, at work, on the bus, train, or plane, or just relaxing at home, plug in your headphones, take a deep breath, and get ready to begin.
Welcome to this month's episode of the Legal Resources Radio, a podcast where we discuss some of the most pressing contemporary human rights issues and what the Legal Resource Center is trying to do about them. Today I am sitting down with Cecile van Skalkwijk, an attorney from the Makhanda office of the Legal Resources Center. By way of introduction to who I am, I'm Claire Rakin, a candidate attorney at the Legal Resources Center, also in the Makhanda office. So Cecile is no stranger to the pod, having previously sat down with our colleague Kamal Harvey to discuss the hotly and now legally contested Expropriation Act. If you haven't checked out that podcast, take a look at our back catalogue. You really don't want to miss it. But today she's going to talk to us a little bit about a case that she's busy with at the Legal Resources Center, representing the Children's Institute and 8 other individual applicants trying to take on the Department of Home Affairs Late Registration of Births Application Backlog. It's a bit of a mouthful, so we'll refer to it as the LRB backlog, but just so we all know, we're talking about late registrations of birth applications. Cecile is no stranger to issues regarding documentation when it comes to children's rights, having previously also been the attorney of record on the now famous Phakamisa case, which recognized that all children, irrespective of their documentation status, have a right to basic education. This application is a little bit different though. It deals with the department's failure to timeously process LRB applications and the fact that they have allowed a significant backlog to develop when it comes to LRB applications. Hi Cecile, how are you doing?
I'm good, great, lovely to be back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Excited to talk about inefficiencies in the Department of Home Affairs?
Nothing excites me more.
So Cecile, I'll be honest with you. Registering birth is something that, unless it goes wrong or you've had children, it's not really something that we ordinarily have a lot to do with in our everyday lives. So just for my benefit and for the listeners' benefit, let's start by talking a little bit about what is birth registration actually, and what more specifically is the late registration of births. What does it entail? Why is it important in a South African context?
Yeah, so the late registration of births in South Africa is primarily governed by the Birth and Death Registrations Act. And the idea is, of course, that when a baby is born in South Africa, I should note whether that is a child of a South African citizen or if it is a child of a foreign national, there is an obligation for that child's birth to be registered because our constitution recognizes the idea that everyone has a right to a name and a nationality. Now, while birth registration is not, is not a prerequisite for you to have a name and a nationality, it is a recognition of your name and nationality, and it gives prima facie proof in the form of a document and your birth certificate that you were born in South Africa. What is your registered name? Who are your parents? And sort of the place where you were born, effectively. Now, the majority of births in South Africa are registered within 30 days after the child is born. We often see that many times in hospitals. Once a child is born, there will be a notice of birth that the hospital will give the parents. They can go, many hospitals, bigger hospitals these days have home affairs offices adjacent to them. Or there's officials that work within the hospital, and you go and you register the child's birth. The child's name gets entered onto our population register, and effectively you become visible, I suppose, to the government of South Africa. For various reasons, which we can talk about later, oftentimes it happens that children are not registered within the first 30 days. So it's pretty easy to get a child registered in the first 30 days. Generally, the mother is still with the child. You've just come out of hospital, or, and it's pretty easy to do so. But once the first 30 days have passed, the process starts what we call a late birth registration. The government then recognizes it as a later birth registration. And then they impose a few more requirements for the birth to be registered. We can talk about some of those requirements later, but for example, one of the things that they want to do is that they insist on having an interview with the parents to talk about sort of, various issues around the birth registration and why it's a late birth registration, that sort of thing. So the bureaucratic kind of process becomes a little bit harder the moment it falls within the late birth registration process. And there's more requirements imposed by the Act and by the regulations. And unfortunately, because of, I think, these additional requirements that have been imposed, we have seen a significant backlog of those applications having built up and not having been dealt with expeditiously by the Department of Home Affairs.
Thanks, Cecile. I mean, it's really interesting to think about. And I think maybe it's important to just contextualize too that the late registration of births is always going to be something in South Africa.
Absolutely.
We've seen the Department of Home Affairs now really try and push early birth registration, which is great. Yeah. Like you said so poetically, birth registration is how you become recognizable to the state. You really go from being someone the state doesn't know about to someone that suddenly they are aware about, they can plan around, and they can ensure that their service delivery takes you into account. But there will always be instances where late registration is essential. So like you said as well, a lot of it's got to do with the kind of hospital you're born in. If you're born in a hospital at all, I mean, home births is still something that happens a lot in South Africa, across the world. We also know geographically sometimes people don't find themselves very close to Department of Home Affairs offices. There's a whole host of things that can happen and sometimes must happen after the birth of a child that delay the ability for parents to go and actually register that child's birth. Essentially, it's just a reality that you can't always register the child's birth within the first 30 days.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a number of factors that we've obviously picked up. I mean, our clients in this matter have various reasons, very good reasons very often, as to why the birth wasn't registered within the first 30 days. You mentioned children being born in hospitals. In very rural areas in provinces in South Africa, we still find that children are born at home, which, there's no hospitals in the area, or, there's no time to travel to the hospital or whatever, for whatever reason. The moment a child is born at home, it does make it slightly more difficult, because then instead of having a notice of birth from the hospital, you require a witness to the birth to accompany you to a Department of Home Affairs to go and do an affidavit to say that they witnessed the birth of the child. It's an additional complication, you can imagine. So very often people don't have that person, or that person's unwilling to travel with them. So that's an issue. But for cultural reasons, we often also see that children, are kept at home for the first 30 days, and that they are not actually allowed to be taken out to a Department of Home Affairs for the birth to be registered. I think a very, very stark reality in South Africa is that many mothers, their own births weren't registered. Yeah. So we often find that mothers give birth to children, especially if they're teenagers, if it's young mothers. Very often they themselves won't yet have IDs. Even if they've got a birth certificate, they might not yet have an ID document, because they're not yet 16, or they're not, they haven't gone through that process yet. And Home Affairs doesn't allow them to register the birth of their child without them having an ID. So that's one scenario, but you often find that many mothers with children whose births haven't been registered, they themselves don't have documentation. And in instances like that, it almost becomes like a cycle. It becomes mother is unregistered. Very often their grandmother is unregistered, and then the child becomes unregistered. Another reality is, and that's just South Africa for you, is that a lot of children are left with family. So what you often find in rural areas especially is that mothers will give birth to children and they will leave the child with extended family, like a grandmother or an aunt or somebody like that. They will go back to the big city and go and work, and then leave that family member or, with a child who that family member can't register because the Department of Home Affairs insists on the mother being present. The mother might only come home once a year. And then automatically that birth gets registered much later than the first 30 days after the child was born. And that's just unfortunately the reality of our country.
And I think we can also take for granted quite easily how easy it is to take time away from work to travel to the Department of Home Affairs. It's a well-known South African meme how long the queues are and everything, and just being able to plot that time out is something that can be very complicated. And I think as well, you touched on this idea that registering births is very linked to the right that every person has to a name and nationality. It's how that's recognized. But birth registration is also instrumental as a right. So being able to prove your identity is, although, and you know this very well, not theoretically actually something that should be a requirement for the exercise of many rights, but is unfortunately within our system often required to allow you to access services, to allow you to exercise your rights to education, your rights of access to healthcare, your right to housing, all of those things. I mean, it's not difficult just to close our eyes and think about how many different processes we go through that require proof of identity. And if you don't have a birth certificate, if you don't have then later an ID document, which a birth certificate itself is a prerequisite for, you're locked out of all of that. So it really is a core human rights issue.
I often think of birth certificates and birth registration as like a gateway right. It is a gateway to many of our other rights. And as you rightly point out, I mean, it shouldn't be a bar, for example, to getting access to healthcare or education. But the reality is that very often when children apply to school, the first thing a school says to them is, can I get your birth certificate? And if you don't have the birth certificate, school says, sorry, can't accommodate you, right? We need the birth certificate, which isn't true. The law says it isn't, but schools don't know that, or they don't implement it, and you get children. I mean, those children become quite vulnerable. I mean, especially they often get excluded from SASSA grants, which is, that's devastating. So you definitely, there's a knock-on effect on a lot of other rights. And if they then grow up to become undocumented children in the system, like who don't have birth certificates, they won't get IDs. They can't open bank accounts. They can't get cell phone contracts. They cannot vote. They cannot. I mean, it's like a knock-on effect for the rest of your life. It has an effect on all the rights, not just basic rights, but political rights later in life.
You really do unfortunately become a ghost in the system.
Absolutely.
If you don't have proof of identity. So understanding then what this issue is really about, let's talk a little bit about the case that you're running here. So Children's Institute, fantastic organization at UCT, really pioneers of children's rights. They have been assisting and trying to help a whole host of different clients when it comes to working through the bureaucratic processes of the Department of Home Affairs. And from how I understand it, they really recognize that there is this huge issue with LRB applications where clients are going back and forth and waiting years before their applications get processed. So tell us a little bit about the case now. Tell us a little bit about the clients that you're representing and what their struggles have been with their LRB applications.
So I mean, I have to give some credit to, as you rightly point out, the Children's Institute, I think, is an amazing organization, a good partner organization of the LRC as well. And they really have for many years, like, worked on the ground with this particular issue. And so what we've done with the application is we have taken a number of their people that have approached the Children's Institute, and people that the Children's Institute have been trying to assist over a number of years to try and obtain their birth certificates for the children. And we've used them as our clients, and the majority of, well, actually all of our clients have, on average, all of them have managed to submit applications for late birth registration. So they've gone to Home Affairs and they've managed to submit the application. They've handed in all the documents that were required, and then you wait, which is where they've all ended up, right? And when I say you wait, some of our clients, I mean, the average wait has been between 2 and 7 years of our group of clients. And so that means some of them submitted an application 7 years ago, and they're still waiting for a birth certificate to be issued to them.
That's shocking.
It is
7
absolutely
years.
shocking. I mean, that is a child could have gone through, primary school in that time. So it's wildly shocking to think that, you've waited that long. And these are not people who haven't attempted to follow up. I mean, some of them have approached social workers to try and to help them. Some of them have been there, 7, 8, 9 times every year. They go back and forth to the Department of Home Affairs. Some of them have been assisted by Children's Institute in following up on some of these issues and trying to get the birth certificate issued. And all they kept being told is, no, you've got to wait. We'll send you an SMS to come for an interview. And that interview seems to never come. So what we've done with the application is the Children's Institute is obviously our first applicant as our institutional applicant. And then we've acted on behalf of the 8 individual applicants who are part of a much larger group of people that are stuck within this backlog. And they've applied to court not just for their own birth certificate and their children's birth certificates to be issued, but also for larger systemic relief to compel the Department of Home Affairs to really come up with a proper plan to deal with the backlog that has been created.
So let's talk about that for a moment, because as I understand it, the review portion takes the department's failure to have made a decision and challenges that. And that's pretty clear cut. Yeah. We've got a good case there. But let's talk about the systemic relief that you're trying to get from the department here. As I understand it, essentially, it's twofold. It's getting the department to report more openly and honestly about the actual figures of how many LRB applications have been received, how many are being processed, what is the actual backlog. But it's also saying, okay, look at your system. What is not working there? Why is it that you are running a system that leaves people waiting 7 years unrecognized? Do a little bit of a diagnosis, come back, report to court, report to us about what have you recognized as the issues and what is your plan to try and address it.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, I don't think that's a huge ask. And you've seen the Department of Home Affairs focus on backlogs in other parts of South Africa. Why do you think this is a backlog that they haven't looked at?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I had quite a bit of hope when the new minister was appointed, because his big thing was backlogs. And I think famously, within about a month after he was appointed as the minister, he eradicated an enormous backlog on work visa applications, But this backlog has not gotten the attention that it deserves. It's ironic to me, because I would imagine that the fate of vulnerable children would be a far greater concern than whether people get work visas to come and work in South Africa. But priorities. So I think that I think there's listen. It's difficult for us. We don't work within Home Affairs, and I think that all we can assess is what our clients tell us and what we've learned from officials who we've engaged with at Home Affairs offices and Children's Institute have engaged with. It seems that, from my perspective, I think, and Home Affairs can very well come and tell the court that there are different reasons for why this backlog has been created, but I think that a couple of reasons are that the application process for late birth registrations it's entirely paper-based, and it seems to sit within the offices, the local offices, rather than being dealt with. I think it's only when you're trying to do a late birth registration over the age of 15 years that it actually gets dealt with at head office in Pretoria. The others are dealt with at local level, and it's entirely paper-based. And I think it's bizarre. Like, you would imagine. I have no idea why it has to be paper-based.
Yeah.
So that seems to, I suppose, I don't know if there's not enough eyes on it from a national level. So it sits with a local office. Local office doesn't give it the attention maybe that it deserves. But then I think also the process that Home Affairs has implemented to deal with these applications seem entirely like it's very difficult. It seems very complicated even to themselves, you know. So, for example, I mean, although the law does not impose this obligation in any place, I mean, it's completely a figment of their own imagination. They have decided that all of these people need to be interviewed, all the parents need to be interviewed before, even if all your papers are in order, we still need you to come for an interview. And in the Western Cape, we've seen that those interviews have only been conducted with the provincial manager, which is one person in the province, had to sit in on all of these interviews. And
wow.
Yeah, so you can imagine one person has to come to all of these interviews. I mean, the backlog, you can't process it like that. It is insane to expect one person to have to deal with all of it. But then, especially since an interview isn't a legal requirement, right? So it's almost complicated it for themselves in a way that is that's unnecessary. And we'll talk a little bit about some of our applicants have now gone through the interview process. I'll talk a little bit later about what that looked like. But there I think is an issue, and I think instead of just there's a very big sort of drive on the side of Home Affairs to try and verify information. You know, it seems that within the first 30 days they're much more willing to just accept that if you submit, for example, a notice of birth, that is a notice of birth that is prima facie, you know, the truth. Whereas the moment the child's birth tries to be registered over the 30 days, they want to verify information at the hospital. They have to call the hospital. They have to do all kinds of things that almost makes the Home Affairs be detectives in these kinds of scenarios. And I think what we've seen with our individual applicants is that, you know, all of them have had all their paperwork effectively in order. You know, once the application was launched, the Home Affairs scurried around and finally just issued them with birth certificates. I think there was one client that had a little bit of an issue that we're dealing with, but the others were plain, easy, you know, very little sort of work that had to be done on them. And I think they've complicated it for themselves. And I hope that what this application will achieve is for Home Affairs to really have a good look at what system they've come up with and think whether this is working. And I'm not working for them. I'm not worried about Home Affairs. I'm asking, is it working for the people on the ground, right? Because we are all clients of Home Affairs. We are. I think the minister just said that at the Woordfees. We are he's the only department that has every single person in this country as a client. And I can tell you, late birth registration isn't working for its clients. That's very true.
No, and I think our entire administration, I mean, it's very clear. The public administration is supposed to be run as effectively and efficiently as possible. It's not just the fact that this particular process deals with the rights of children. So we know that the best interests of the child are paramount, and you really need to be prioritizing vulnerable children in any system. But we also know that the Constitution requires the public administration to operate in a way that puts people first. And that's just not happening from what you're saying and what we've seen. I think it's also quite important maybe to emphasize it's something in general we see this criticism of when it comes to litigation, and this idea that the department and the government so regularly tries to phrase attempts to look at their processes as CSOs or, you know, litigants trying to tell them how to do the business of government. And that's really not what you're trying to do here. Children's Institute isn't trying to dictate to the department how they need to manage the LRB process. They're just saying it's not working. We've seen that from our clients. Can you please take a look and come back and tell us how you're going to fix it? So the ball's still left entirely in the department's court.
Yes, no, of course. I mean, I think a court, you've got the separation of powers issue. So a court cannot exactly tell Home Affairs how to fix its system, but it certainly can. It can tell the court that it can tell Home Affairs that what you're doing clearly is not efficient.
Well, then I suppose let's talk about the applicants and their experience since this application launched. So you launched the application end of 2024, December. And we've just had answering affidavits filed by the department almost a year later, which we'll take our wins where we can get them. But the really big win for this application has been, I suppose, what the individual applicants have experienced since it launched. So as you said, some of them have been waiting up to 7 years to have their applications processed. Application is launched. Suddenly now they start to get the call that you can come for your interviews. Tell us a little bit about their experiences.
Yeah, so I mean, as you pointed out, the application was launched in December, I think it was 17 December 2024. If the normal rules of court had to be applied, we would have expected an answering affidavit sort of towards, I think, the end of January of 2025. We received it yesterday, which was the 20th of October 2025. So, no rush there. But what we saw, initially after it was launched, we had no response from the department. And then I think it was around May, if I'm not mistaken, we suddenly saw the department contact the individual applicants in this matter and said, come for your interviews, you've got an hour. And suddenly it was a massive rush. Our poor clients had to, leave work and do this and do that and had to come in immediately for these interviews. So that their applications can be assessed. And what was interesting to us, as it's like I said, we don't work for Home Affairs. So one would imagine, I always gave them sort of a little bit of a benefit of the doubt in thinking that maybe these interviews serve a very good purpose. Maybe they are there for Home Affairs to ask very compelling questions of people as, why these although you don't have to give a reason why you're applying late, the process is there. I thought maybe something profound was happening within these interviews. The experience of our clients have been harrowing. And this is definitely something that we will put in front of the court in our replying papers now that we've received the answer. But the majority of them have reported that they were told by Home Affairs officials before they even went into the interviews that you have to admit in the interview that you were negligent in not registering your child's birth within the first 30 days. And if you admit to that, then we will give the birth certificate, right?
Cecile, does negligence, does the reason why a parent failed to register their birth actually have anything to do with the child's entitlement to have their birth registered?
It's not a legal requirement either in the act or the regulations. You don't have to give, whether you've got a good reason or a bad reason is irrelevant to the question as to whether the child is entitled to a birth certificate. The assessment is on the papers in front of the Home Affairs. It's not, you don't need a good reason. You don't need to admit to negligence. You don't need to do any of that.
So that's interesting because, like you say, the reason why a birth has been registered late has nothing to do with the actual processing of that application. It is wholly irrelevant. So what you'd imagine would be relevant is actually trying to prove the identity of the child. So have the clients experienced any attempt to verify the child's identity, or have we really just seen the interviews become really a bureaucratic witch hunt?
The majority of them have been subject to just questions about why the birth is being registered late, and ultimately being compelled and forced into admitting that they were negligent, even if they weren't. And even if they were negligent, it is no business of the Department of Home Affairs, right? We've seen in some of the interviews that there have been attempts at sort of saying, just verifying certain information that was already in front of them, so on the papers. But the interview itself, a lot of the verifications seem to have happened outside the realm of the interview. So what we've seen is sometimes they'll phone a hospital in another province to check whether or not whether they have a record as well that the child was born there, that sort of verification, but that happens outside the realm of the interview. And the majority of the clients we have, honestly, those interviews meant nothing. Like the versions of what happened there that they reported to us, it served zero purpose in terms of deciding whether or not this child is entitled to a birth certificate or not. It seems, that's a common, it seems like to be a common thread and a common experience that people have. So you're wasting 7 years of a child's life so that you can ask the parent to admit to negligence in an interview. It's a ridiculous process.
Yeah, and especially if you take into account that with a lot of the applicants, the parents didn't wait anywhere close to 7 years before actually trying to register the child's birth.
And we had one of the clients reported and said that the Home Affairs official in the interview said to them, you were negligent in not registering your child's birth within the first 30 days. So you can't expect us as Home Affairs to fall over ourselves and do everything we must to quickly give your child a birth certificate if you were negligent. And I think that narrative is really looking at, I think it misconstrues what Home Affairs thinks its job is. It is not policing the society that we live in. They have a job to issue documents to deserving children who were born in this country to, all of them are South African citizens. They are all children who are entitled to a South African birth certificate and to be entered onto the population register. It's also this issue of bestowing even if you admit that the parents were negligent and didn't do what they were supposed to, it is bestowing the sins of the parents on the child and punishing a child for something they had absolutely no control over, which is ridiculous. It's not the job of Home Affairs to do that. There's no state entity that has that job.
Yeah. And as I understand it as well, it's, pretty established and accepted by our courts that is a completely impermissible stance to take in the first place.
Yeah.
It really can't be emphasized enough that as soon as children's rights are involved, the protection that they are afforded in that system is elevated. I mean, we all have rights. Everyone does, but the particular vulnerabilities of children actually mean that you should be falling over yourselves to try and make sure that they are protected.
100%.
I think what's fascinating is the department almost doesn't realize how their delay here actually really is the source of negligence and really does make children's lives far more difficult, makes their caregivers' lives far more difficult, and at the end of the day makes the government's life far more difficult, because if you don't have an accurate understanding and reflection of what your population size is, your planning is never going to be effective.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Your ability to anticipate the needs of the population and make sure that your service provision aligns with it is never going to work. So it really is self-defeating at the end of the day. It's not just an absolute travesty of human rights, but it's also just a bizarre way for any government to function. And I really hope the application allows for the department to see that and to try and push to move this process further. Something that's interesting, and maybe it would be nice to get your thoughts on this, the department's also moving a little bit more towards trying to prioritize private partnerships and innovate when it comes to any kind of document registration. So we see banks are being relied on far more heavily for rolling out ID applications and passport applications and the like. And there's a strong move to taking systems away from a paper-based model to something done electronically, which is really good. Do you think that kind of innovation is, one, something that you could see applied to the LRB process? But two, should we also be careful about what a push for increasing private partnerships for the Department of Home Affairs could potentially mean for more vulnerable, more isolated clients?
Yeah. So, I mean, I know that in engagements with the Children's Institute, the department has been quite clear that they view sort of the technological innovation and sort of the privatization of a lot of these services as a mechanism to try and move a lot more people out of Home Affairs offices on ground level and into sort of the banks, so people who are customers of banks and whatever, they can sort out their Home Affairs things through their banks. But then the idea that Home Affairs says it has is then that it leaves those offices with a lot more capacity to be able to deal with sort of your more difficult things like your late birth registration applications, which at this point is still a paper-based system, right? And that you'd be able to do that. I mean, I think that one of the concerns that we've shared, Children's Institute have shared with us, is that I think their concern is that the move to privatization ultimately also means that there will be less money that will be spent from Home Affairs aside on actual Home Affairs offices, and that we'll see maybe a closure of those offices because they might not be, they might not be used in the same way that they had been previously. Not as many staff members will be needed because you've got the banks effectively taking over a lot of the work that Home Affairs officials would have been doing. The reality is that the type of clients we work with probably are they're very often marginalized. They're very often indigent individuals. Their children, their births often aren't registered, which means that they're unlikely to be customers of banks. They're unlikely to be able to use that system effectively anyway. And they really are very reliant on what is happening at local Home Affairs offices and being able to access those services at a local Home Affairs office. What we hope this move to digitalization, privatization will mean is not that you'll see a decrease of Home Affairs officers, Home Affairs staff, capacity at Home Affairs level, because that will be devastating, I think, for the type of person that often finds themselves having to apply for late birth registration applications. So I think that is a concern. We'll only probably see the effect of that in a couple of years. And I really hope that the department, by prioritizing digitalization and by prioritizing privatization, also prioritizes what services are afforded at their own offices.
Yeah, and I think as well, a lot of the reasons that are cited for the applicant's delay in actually, or rather not delay, because that's the wrong way of phrasing it, but their need for a late registration of births process is the fact that they are isolated from Home Affairs officers already in the status quo, where we don't see a complete shift across to private institutions. So if it's already causing an issue, it's going to be something that will just become exponentially worse. And I think as well, that's something that's quite innovative about what it is that the Children's Institute is trying to do with this particular case. So like we said earlier, they're trying to get the department to remedy its inefficiencies. But they've also asked for something quite unique. They've asked for the department to come back to court and report to court on what their plan is to address the backlog, and allow for the Children's Institute and allow for other interested parties and the other applicants to actually comment on that plan. So it's a built-in mechanism to try and make sure that any blind spots the department has when they formulate this plan can be remedied. Two questions here. Should we really be going to court to ask the department to open up their policy development to public comment, to public input? And secondly, this is really a case that's going to boil down to shaping how the department functions and how it designs its processes. Is that ordinarily something that's quite transparent? Does the public have any say in that at the moment?
So in Home Affairs, I mean, we obviously have rules and regulations around public participation in lawmaking processes. But so, for example, if there were to be amendments to, for example, the Birth and Death Registrations Act, or if you were to see amendments to, or a new act being introduced or something, there would be Parliament would run public participation processes. You'd see the National Council of Provinces doing that. Unfortunately, I think what has happened in this instance is it seems that a lot of this process is being run by policies that the department internally implements, right? That is often very difficult to find. It's not, you can't just, it's hard to just Google and see, oh, this is the plan or the policy that the department internally uses when they are dealing with birth registration applications, late birth registration applications. We've seen a lot of those documents have come through to us, through people that we've known within the department, or people that will say, okay, yeah, this is the policy, but it's not necessarily easily accessible. I've never seen that process be subject to public participation, so it's not like I, as an individual who is interested in this kind of process, can at any point say to the department, the department won't say, we're introducing a new internal policy about how we are regulating our processes. Does the public think this will work for you? People who are affected by this, will this work for you? We haven't seen that. We haven't seen that be implemented. And I think this is an attempt to try and leave space for something like that to be able to happen. But I also think that it is, structural interdicts, which this is a structured manner of the court sort of keeping an oversight over the manner in which the department is implementing its order, is really aimed to make sure that, we have no faith that the department will on its own come up with a process. If it hasn't done it in the last 7 years while our clients have been waiting, we certainly don't have faith that it will happen on its own.
And we can't risk
the
lives of children.
Exactly. So I think part of why we've asked the court to order this sort of structured interdict is because we think that there is a need for us and for the courts to maintain some level of input and control over how the department approaches this process going forward. Because if you leave them to develop the plan, they might come up with a brilliant plan, or they might come up with a terrible plan that doesn't actually reflect the needs of people on the ground. And I think it's, and we don't know what that plan will look like, but we certainly want to be able to say, yes, this will work, no, this won't work, and to give some input to Home Affairs, hopefully, and them listen to us.
Well, here's hoping that is actually where we see this ending up, because I do think it's terrible that a government that is constitutionally required to operate in a transparent manner, in a responsive manner, is able to shape policies and procedures that so intimately impact on people's everyday lives without allowing individuals the opportunity to, one, even just know what the procedure is. And I think that that's quite telling, because all of the applicants that we have here walk into Home Affairs unaware of what Home Affairs process actually is for managing an LRB application, and have to just hope that the officials do their job correctly. And if you don't know what process is supposed to be followed, it's very difficult for you to identify when something goes wrong. And it's very difficult for you to stand your ground and try and argue for the treatment that you're entitled to, because you really don't know any better at that point. But two, we can see that blind spots can develop in policies. We can see in the Department of Home Affairs right now, there's a very real risk of that happening. So at least hopefully with opening up this process, we can maybe start to see more responsive policy development. This has been fascinating, Cecile, talking a little bit about how this case came to be, what it is that you're trying to do. Also, I think a huge victory for the applicants, now 7 of whom have walked away with birth certificates for their children.
Well, actually, it's I mean, we've managed to obtain, I think, 14 birth certificates.
Oh, yes,
we included in our application, apart from the 7 individual applicants, we included a list of other people who didn't want to be individual applicants, but who were also affected, and they've also obtained their birth certificates. And I think what that shows is it can be done. It's not once attention's given to the problem, it can be done,
It's not some Herculean
it's not
task.
No, I think it's just about it's about thinking, like just putting resources into it and making sure that it I also just want to mention something about the transparency issue. I mean, I think what's fascinating is just exactly the thing about people not really knowing what is expected of them. So let's say, for example, that you are somebody who has access to the internet and you can just Google what documents must I take to Home Affairs, when I do a late birth registration application. Nowhere on the department's website will it ever tell you that you've got to go for an interview.
Yeah.
So you arrive at Home Affairs and then you may be able to submit your documents. Sometimes they insist on other documents. Sometimes you have to get school registers for the child and you've got to submit report cards and all kinds of strange things that are not legally prescribed by any of the laws or regulations. And then you're told, and then there's this interview, which is nowhere prescribed. In law, it's not on their website. You wouldn't know that until and then you have to wait until who knows when. Like nobody tells you and says, none of our clients were told you'll get a call within X amount of time. People were told you'll get a call when you get a call, and every couple of months they'll follow up and then they'll tell you your call hasn't come yet,
Yeah.
So it's that cannot be how it's a very important thing this in our country, and I don't think that that's how we can manage it, unfortunately, going forward.
No, and I think again it's this just focuses on one process that the department is responsible for, but hopefully somewhere it lights a spark, it starts a way of thinking that translates into more transparency, more responsiveness elsewhere. So like we said earlier, received answering papers. What's next in the case? We're going to see that the applicants will file their reply. We'll finish up with the pleading stage. And then are you hoping to be in court to have the matter heard next year?
Yeah, I think realistically it's in the Western Cape High Court. So realistically, we're probably looking at a date only next year, just given, the sort of number of cases that the court is dealing with. We'll certainly try to get our replying papers in as soon as possible. I mean, I think this case has been delayed absolutely. It's been delayed for more than 9 months effectively by the inability of the department to file answering papers.
There's some brutal irony in that, right?
It is.
It's a case about delay.
Yes. It's horrendous. I've never, we've been forced to bring chamber book applications through the Western Cape High Court, which in and of itself has been a massive process, but just to compel the department to file answering papers. And I think that, to be honest with you, we often litigate against government, and I expect very often in litigation with government for the government to be lethargic and not to meet court deadlines and do the things that they're supposed to. But for me, this case has been particularly worrying in how lethargic the department has been in answering this case, because this is a case, as you say, about delays, but it's a case about very vulnerable children.
Yeah.
And I cannot imagine that it is, the department sitting for 9 months and saying, we haven't gotten it together. We haven't filed paperwork. We can't come up with an answer for you, there's been no proper excuse provided to us as to why this has happened. We've had to go to court to compel them through a court order to file their answering papers. I have no excuse for that. I'm sorry. It's absolutely deplorable.
I don't
on
think
its
you
base
need
level.
To. We wouldn't want you to have to excuse the department.
But
don't worry.
I generally expect the department to be, expect government to be slow. I understand it's a big thing. It's a big animal that has to be navigated. But this is inexcusable. Yeah. So we'll file replying papers probably within the next month. And then, we'll apply for a date at court for the matter to be heard.
Well, Cecile, we are wishing you all of the luck with that hearing, and hopefully then next year we'll have you back on the podcast to unpack a positive judgment in the Children's Institute's favor.
Hopefully.
Thank you for sitting down with us. Thank you for chatting to us about this really important case and for all the work that you do on it. And we really hope that this has been a fascinating conversation for you to listen to at home. And keep an eye out for the next podcast where we talk about some more exciting cases that the LRC has on its books at the moment. Thanks, Cecile.
Thank you.